In the last episode of Build, we talked about the various personas when it comes to the product manager role and how to go about sourcing candidates. If you missed that episode, I've included a link to it below. Next, you're probably thinking, okay, given how nuanced the product manager role is, how do you go about actually interviewing and making sure they have the right skill set? And often this can cause the interview process to become really fragmented. You start to see some interviews that are very technical, others that try to expose business skills, and a third set that might just involve mostly soft skills. And if you don't have that right set of criteria or practices, some of the best candidates can just fall through the pipeline. So in today's episode, we're going to expose some of those best practices. Stick around. Welcome to Build, brought to you by Pivotal Tracker. I'm your host, Purnima Vijay Shankar. In each episode, innovators and I debunk a number of myths and misconceptions related to building products, companies, and your career in tech. Now, we've been talking about the product manager role, how nuanced it is, how to source candidates, and also how to go about interviewing. Now, given how nuanced it can be, it's a challenge to set objective interview criteria as well as consistent practices to expose the skills that you need for your company and for your team. But fear not, because in today's episode, we're going to share some of that objective criteria and some best practices that you can adopt for your interviews. And to help us out, Jeana Alayaay is back. You'll recall that Jeana leads the product management and design for Pivotal's IT group. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me again.
Yeah. So I've got to admit that I've gone through a number of product management interviews myself. And after spending countless hours doing interview questions related to technical skills and business skills, and then having done the work of actually leading teams and building products and shipping them, I was kind of surprised by the feedback that I got from some of the interviewers saying I needed to do even more, to get the role. So, why does this happen? And it makes people feel like maybe you just need to answer the questions a certain way to get through the interview. So it's like taking a test instead of knowing the information.
Yeah, so I think there's three things here. I think one, there's a total disconnect between the job postings and what a company is actually looking for. So I think the way that I've thought about it is a job posting is actually part of the company's larger marketing collateral, right? So you're not actually going to get the real deal on culture. This thing, it's never going to say hey, looking for PM to walk into super hostile and fickle product, right? It's never going to say that,
exactly.
Right? And so I don't know that we can change that bit, but I think what we can say is okay, where's the next touch point with the candidate? And it's with recruiting, right? And so I think doing a lot of upfront work with recruiting sort of improves this, but I'm jumping a little bit ahead here. So I think the second problem is that the hiring group itself isn't actually aligned on what sort of profiles they're looking for, right? So you have anywhere from 2 to 9 interviewers who are going in, interviewing the candidate. They get to the end of the process, pull together all that data, and you can't actually agree on whether or not to hire the person because no one ever said, this is what a good candidate looks like, or even better, this is what a bad candidate looks like. Because, as we all know, sometimes it's hard to know what good looks like, but we can definitely say, what bad looks like, or this isn't going to fit. I think the third related thing is that the interview process most often doesn't actually resemble the environment that the candidate would actually be walking into should they get the job, right? So a lot of companies have this prisoner's dilemma process where it's you go from person to person to person to person, and they ask you, sometimes it's on script, sometimes they have their own scripts, right? But that doesn't actually resemble a product manager's job of doing a lot of work in groups, going around getting alignment, a lot of collaboration. I just don't think it resembles the environment at all. And so they get to that end of the process, and they say no because they don't think the candidate's going to be successful in the environment, but they've never actually given the candidate the chance to demonstrate whether they would be, right? Because it doesn't look anything like that.
Yeah. So then how do you get that criteria, or how do you kind of build that into the interview process?
I think in general, we don't put enough time into hiring, right? And so we put a lot of focus on the hiring manager, but we don't talk about the other interviewers, right? Everything from hey, what is the group looking for, to are the interviewers themselves actually prepared to interview, right? So I've come across these interesting situations where, the interview process for one company or another is like posted on Glassdoor, and that team says, well, we've got to change the interview process because the candidate will know what to say, right? And I go, well, do you actually know what questions to ask to get at that data, right? Like outside of following the script. Like, do you know in your gut what you're looking for, what the company is looking for? Can you ask that question 10 different ways, right? So we don't often talk about whether the interviewers themselves are actually prepped to do this work.
Oh, totally. There's such a thing as a bad interviewer.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you end up with, like, again, 2 to 9 people who are doing totally different things. And none of that's really giving you a clear signal about whether or not this person is going to be successful in this company. Right?
Yeah. So how do you then, I guess, prep the interviewers and then convey the criteria back to the candidate?
Yeah, so 2-part here. I think one is you actually need to train interviewers, right? And so at least on my team, I don't have folks interview who don't have experience interviewing, right? So they should actually have to shadow other folks, cross-discipline and within discipline, that have interviewed before and actually understand what that process should look like and understand from the hiring manager what they're looking for. So like sending somebody in cold, no matter what level they're at, is like, you're not going to get the best outcome out of that. So I think going back to the recruiting process, I think it's totally fine and good to tell the recruiter, to tell the candidate, here's what they're looking for, right? And I think this is a lot like the sort of Glassdoor problem that I was talking about before. I've heard people push back against that and say, well, then the candidate's going to know.
Right.
And I say, I'm not sure that that's the case, right? So in our case at Pivotal, we hire for empathy, right? But I'm sure you can ask questions of the candidate to figure out whether or not they're empathetic. Like, if you're relying on the candidate saying, yes, I'm empathetic, right, you've already like gone off the rails. So
yeah, and I think a lot of times candidates either don't necessarily follow the instructions they've been given, or they decide to kind of go off on their own tangent to make sure that they appear good in front of the interviewer's eyes. So there's definitely different ways in which they can miss the mark. But if you can give them some crystal clear criteria of what to expect and what the interviewers are going to want to see in terms of their resume or their experience, then I think that's more helpful. So now, in terms of the actual interview, do you have a set of practices that you recommend?
Yeah, so I think I actually usually step in the second interview, right? Because I think it's really important they encounter the hiring manager early on and then at the end. And so I reiterate what the recruiter has said, which is like, hey, these are my expectations for the role, and I give them permission not to buy. And I think this is really important, right? Because you're interviewing them, but they're also interviewing you, right? And so it's like you've both got to want to be there. Yeah. And so I think giving a candidate the chance to say like, no, this isn't actually for me, before like sort of shepherding them into this longer interview process is important. The other thing I've talked about before, which is like, make sure you've prepped your team on how to interview, right? And also set really clear expectations. So I actually have a document, like a really detailed document outlining like what I'm looking for, like things to watch out for, responses that I might expect, like different scenarios that you might end up in. So like that way the interviewers go on, they feel prepared, and we get more consistency out of the responses.
So you do even list like a bank of questions.
Yeah.
Okay. That way it's not like the same person or multiple people asking the same question, or you found out that 50% of the interview was on data analytics and you're not even hiring for that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And then they're all sort of like different versions of the same question. And I always say like, hey, you folks who are interviewing, figure out a way to say this that feels authentic to you. Sure. But like, this is what we're trying to get at, right? Yeah. Like, this is the data that we're trying to get from the person.
I think that's helpful. I think also having the responses, like what the expectation is for some of the responses, because some of the feedback that candidates either get or don't get is how detailed the response should have been.
Yes.
So they may think they need to be pithy and save the interviewer time and just kind of scratch the surface when the interviewer is really looking for, no, I expected you to spend 30 minutes to highlight every single corner case of this particular product feature or whatnot. So I think it's helpful if you have that bank of what should the response actually look like, kind of like a test. Yeah. Where, at the end of the day, you can go back and say, this is how we graded you, and because this was the answer we were looking for.
Yeah, and little like ticks are helpful for that. So I would say like if they're expecting a long answer, there's no reason why you shouldn't say to the candidate, say more, or could you elaborate, right?
Yeah.
So I think we too often just like let the candidate fall into the dark.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you're after something, like let's set them up to actually give the responses that we want, right? So
nice. What do you do for new roles though? Because this is great where maybe somebody left the company or got promoted and now you're filling this role. But in the case of a brand new role, I think a lot of times people don't even know, as in the interviewers, the hiring manager, they're kind of like, we need them, I know, to do this and this, but what else do we need them to do?
Yeah, I think this is where it's really important that the hiring team actually get into a room beforehand and put a stake in the ground. So you're not going to know 100% what you need to, like what you need the role to do, but you have some sense of it, and people have an idea in their mind, and it's really important that that idea come out in a way that's accessible to other people, because otherwise you end up in the problem that I was talking about before, which is everyone has a slightly different idea, and it has even less structure than you would for a role that already exists.
Right.
And then so everyone's really all over the place, because it's like Purnima goes in, she's like, I think we need a data person. And I go in and I'm like, I think we need a community person. And, you know, lo and behold, we end up like revving on this for months and months and months, unable to fill the role.
Yeah. So I think oftentimes what happens is people don't know what they want. And then the poor candidate's like, what did I do wrong? I thought I spent all this time preparing and followed the job description and listened to what the interviewer or rather the recruiter said. So I just feel like I'm lost. And then it ends up being a branding issue for the company.
Yep. And it's a really resource heavy activity. So, you know, I always ask, like, do we really want to send folks in who don't know what they want, right? Like, I know that we want to fill this role, but if we can't take 30 minutes or a couple hours to like put, you know, some shape around it, like, is it worth us even opening up the pipeline, right?
That's a good.
And those are conversations that are don't happen enough and are hard to have.
So then how do you go about, once you do have some candidates, you've walked them through the pipeline, how do you go about consolidating the feedback from each of the interviewers? Because again, you know, there's definitely some tough interviewers who were aiming for like 100, 110%. And then there are some people who are like, this person knows like 80 to 90, and then they seem really coachable.
Yeah.
So we can all pull together and get them up to speed. So how do you consolidate that feedback from all the individuals?
Yeah, so the first thing we do is actually jump into a room and do a Roman vote. So we have everybody vote whether or not to even move forward with the candidate. Because what I found in the past is, like, you could be in there for an hour sort of talking through, like, the candidate did this well, they didn't do this well, and it's like 5 people have already decided that it's a no. Right? So again, just being respectful of everybody's time, like, you don't need to do that. So, like, first, let's just, like, get a count of, like, who wants to move forward, who doesn't, right? Folks who are a no, it's important to have a few of them sort of speak up and, like, add some color to why they think it's a no, and then also on the yes side. Then again, like a document or some sort of info radiator that captures what you were looking for to begin with is really important to bring to the table and say, okay, here's what we were looking for. How do each of these candidates like match this or don't match this? And I even include things like coachability and humility, right? And so sometimes like you're looking for somebody who's super coachable. And so, you know, you've got to go around and say, like, hey, I know you didn't hear what you wanted to hear, but, like, are they coachable? Like, reiterating what we're looking for, not do they know everything. Right? So points like that become, like, really important in, like, synthesizing that data.
Yeah. So for you, do you do an anonymous vote first, and then once you have kind of the yes-no counts, then do a deeper dive? Because otherwise people can get colored, right?
Yeah, it's a silent vote, and a Roman vote's really interesting because you all do it at once, right? So you sort of do a 1, 2, and then, you know, up is yes, like sideways is, you know, move with the will of the group, and down is no, or I have something to say. So everyone votes at the same time. We start off that way.
Got it.
And then we sort of move in. We usually reserve like at least an hour afterward to like talk it through.
Some companies rely on a unanimous set of votes, and some leave it up to the hiring manager to kind of make the final decision. How do you view either one?
Yeah, you know, I can't say for sure because it has to be right for that culture, but I would say I consider myself to be a tiebreaker more than like the person who makes the decision at the end of the day, though like functionally I often am. But you know, thinking about like your hiring team, right? These are the folks, or should be the folks, that your candidate's going to work with, right? And so if you don't actually respect their opinion, you've got one problem.
Yeah.
Right? And if they weren't prepped for the interview, so they don't know what they were looking for, you've got another problem. And I don't think either of those is solved by me making the decision, right? Like, that's a problem we should have solved like a couple hours ago versus like now.
Got it. And any red flags or signals that you want to watch out for in candidates?
Yeah, so for me, it's over solutioning, right? So what I like to see is like a lot of curiosity and like deep attention to the problem, right? So, I don't know if this is like the best analogy, but we often refer to our product managers as like bloodhounds, right? So it's like you really want folks who are like seeking after the problem, and they're asking 5 why. So it's like when they find a problem, they say why and why again, why again, why again, and that we're not jumping into solutioning, right? So it's like we're in this really interesting moment in time in the industry where it's like it's actually super easy to build, right? And so it's like you don't want to build too quickly because it's like all of that stuff's going to be maintained, right? So it's like so expensive to maintain and like maintain that thing into the future that like you don't want to build anything you don't have to build. Right. So I would say like if they're over solutioning, I consider that to be a red flag. I think the other one is like not engaging. Right, with the audience, right? So you have like a few different versions of this, but it's like sometimes they're only focused on the hiring manager, or even when you have like there are like gender dynamics going on and whatever the case may be, like you want to see that they're engaging with the whole room. And that like you're starting to get a sense of the type of communication that you're going to see from them on a day-to-day basis, right? And sometimes that actually means putting them into uncomfortable situations. So it's like in a later stage of our interview process, I actually like throw them curveballs and I say like, okay, something's gone wrong. Like, what are you going to do about it? Like to get a sense of like how they think on their feet, like whether they accept the situation with grace, whether they reach out for help. So another big red flag for me is product managers who are uncomfortable saying, I don't know, right? Because then we're hiring somebody who like wants or thinks they should be a hero persona and is not going to rely on the wisdom of the group to make decisions, right? They're going to feel like they need to go away in a cave. And you just can't do that with the types of products we're building, right? Because it's too multi-part, right? If you've got hardware and software and business or like supply chain innovation, there's no way any one person knows all the things.
Right. Nice. And what about feedback? Some companies are very strict about saying, nope, we absolutely don't give candidates feedback afterwards because of X, Y, and Z reason. Others might kind of give a little teaser. And then I've seen others where they're like, we want you to come back in 6 months or even sooner than that. So here are very deliberate things to work on for the next round.
Yeah. So I think 2 of those things resonated with me. I think one is like giving feedback about why they weren't a fit today is really important, right? So in most cases, it's because they're not a fit today. It's not because they're not a fit at all. Sure, there's always folks where you're like, this is never going to work. But that's not often the case. So saying like, hey, here's what we were looking for. Again, like you weren't a fit for today, but maybe you would be a fit in the future or for this specific scenario, and here's what we'd be looking for. I think is a fine conversation to have. I don't know that like nitpicking folks is necessarily productive because again, like there's a lot of like personal biases that go into that, and I don't know that that's the best use of your time or the candidate's time.
That makes sense. So sometimes when we're giving this feedback, or even when we're consolidating this feedback, we have this light bulb moment where we're like, oh, actually, this candidate doesn't meet our 1, 3, or 10 checkboxes. But for some gut reason, we feel compelled to want to hire them. Right? Has that happened to you? And kind of how do you justify that to your team?
So when thinking about some of those checkboxes and some that I'm familiar with across the industry, I think specifically about like technical skills, right? And that's just like, that's a broad term. That could be anything. But if you're hiring a product manager, is that the most important thing, right? And I'm not saying hire somebody that's like never built software. That's not what I'm advocating for. But I do think we like put too much stock into that, right? Where it's like, hey, there's a reason we have developers and data scientists and all of that, right? Like there's a lot of folks on a team who can sort of like pick up that specific work. So thinking about like what you actually want them to be doing and like whether or not they fit that. And then again, like thinking about whether they're coachable. right? Let's just like suspend disbelief here and say that we're always hiring smart people, and I hope that's the case. Though sometimes I've gotten in the room with other hiring people, and they're like, well, we should hire smart people, and
Yeah.
and I think, is there someone here that's not hiring smart people?
Right.
So like, let's just say we're always hiring smart people. So looking at what ramp time is for that person. So maybe they just need a few extra months to sort of like marinate in some specific hard skills, but like they have all those other soft skills, which are a lot harder to acquire, right? Like a lot of those soft skills are like, years and years and years and very experience based.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Jeana, for sharing your best practices when it comes to interviewing product managers.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Now, Jeana and I want to know, what are your best practices when it comes to interviewing product managers as candidates? Let us know in the comments below this video. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to receive the next episode, where we'll talk about how to train as well as retain your product managers. Ciao for now.
This episode of Build is brought to you by our main sponsor, Pivotal Tracker. We'd also like to thank our Platinum Patreon patrons, Corky Bites, The Developer Show, and Jamie Hand. Finally, thanks to the following new patrons. If you've enjoyed watching Build, please consider becoming a patron and contributing on Patreon at www.patreon.com/build. You can pledge $5 a month or more, and your pledges will go towards helping us produce and promote the show. In exchange, you'll receive perks like being mentioned in the credits, digital copies of our latest book, and Platinum patrons will receive exclusive perks like monthly online group coaching, where I provide more hands-on coaching on a number of topics related to entrepreneurship and leadership. To find out more and contribute, please visit www.patreon.com/build.